Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back, way back, not just through centuries but through millennia, to a city of shimmering white marble, bustling harbors, and a legendary institution dedicated to an almost impossibly grand idea collecting all the knowledge in the known world. Imagine a place where the greatest minds of antiquity gathered, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls, debating, discovering, and diligently copying the wisdom of ages. Tonight, we're wandering through the hallowed halls and dusty corridors of imagination to explore the whispers from papyrus that tell us about daily life in and around the Great Library of Alexandria. Now, if you were suddenly dropped into this ancient intellectual powerhouse, expected to debate philosophy with a disciple of Aristotle or calculate the circumference of the earth with Eratosthenes before your morning papyrus latte, you probably won't survive this academic boot camp without your brain feeling thoroughly and delightfully squeezed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always a thrill to think about these ancient stories reaching across time and space to you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean, the salty air mingling with the exotic scents of spices from distant lands and the faint, papery aroma of countless scrolls. This is Alexandria, a city born from the ambitious vision of Alexander the Great himself, founded around 331 BCE. Though Alexander didn't live to see his namesake city truly flourish, his dream of a magnificent cosmopolitan center, a bridge between Greek and Egyptian cultures, and a hub of learning, was enthusiastically taken up by his successor in Egypt, Ptolemy the First Soter. It's under Ptolemy's astute patronage, and that of his descendants, that Alexandria transforms from a promising coastal settlement into the intellectual and cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. The city itself is a marvel of planning and ambition. Laid out on a grid system, its wide, colonnaded streets are thronged with a vibrant, multicultural populace: Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Macedonians, traders from across the Mediterranean and beyond. You hear a babble of languages, see a kaleidoscope of different styles of dress. The great lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, pierces the sky, its beacon guiding ships into the city's bustling twin harbors. The royal quarter, the Bruchion, gleams with palaces, temples, and lush gardens. And nestled within this opulent heart of the city, near the royal palace, lies the institution that will become legendary, the Mouseion, or Temple of the Muses. The Mouseion isn't just a temple in the religious sense, though it is dedicated to the 9 muses, the Greek goddesses of the arts and sciences. It is, in essence, the world's first true government-sponsored research institute, a kind of ancient think tank and university rolled into one. A key historical fact is that Ptolemy the Soter, advised by scholars like Demetrius of Phalerum, an exiled Athenian statesman and philosopher, envisioned the Mouseion as a place where the brightest minds could gather, free from the daily necessity of earning a living to pursue scholarship, research, and intellectual discourse. They were provided with stipends, lodging, and access to resources, all funded by the royal treasury. It was a pretty sweet gig if you were a 3rd century BCE intellectual, free room and board. And all you had to do was, advance the sum of human knowledge. No pressure. And the jewel in the crown of the Mouseion, its beating heart and most famous component, was the Great Library of Alexandria. The ambition behind its creation was breathtakingly audacious: to collect copies of all the significant written works of the known world, in every language, on every conceivable subject: poetry, drama, history, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, geography. Ptolemy and his successors weren't just aiming for a good local library, they were aiming for a universal repository of human thought, a place where the accumulated wisdom of all cultures could be gathered, preserved, studied, and built upon. It was a project of almost unimaginable scale, driven by a potent mixture of genuine intellectual curiosity, cultural pride, and shrewd political ambition. Possessing all the world's knowledge was, after all, a powerful statement of Ptolemaic prestige and Alexandrian supremacy. Oh, you have a nice little collection of scrolls in Athens. That's cute. We're trying to get everything. Might have been the unspoken Alexandrian motto. The physical structure of the library itself, as part of the larger Mausian complex, likely included covered walkways, peripetoi for scholars to stroll and discuss, lecture halls, reading rooms, dining halls, and, of course, vast storage areas for the ever-growing collection of papyrus scrolls. A quirky tidbit often mentioned is that some descriptions suggest the Mausion also included botanical gardens and a zoological park, making it a true center for all kinds of research, not just textual studies. Imagine Euclid, puzzling over a geometric proof, being momentarily distracted by the squawk of an exotic bird imported from Ethiopia, or Archimedes, deep in thought about livers, nearly tripping over a wandering tortoise. Historians still argue about the exact original layout of the Mausoleum and the library, as no definitive archaeological remains of the main library building have been conclusively identified. Much of what we know comes from later Roman writers like Strabo, who visited Alexandria and described the complex. But the vision is clear: it was intended as a vibrant, collaborative intellectual environment, a place where scholars didn't just read in isolation but engaged in lively debate, shared their findings, and mentored a new generation of thinkers. This city of muses was therefore designed from its inception to be a beacon, attracting the best and brightest from across the Hellenistic world. The Ptolemies understood that knowledge was power, and that by making Alexandria the undisputed center of learning, they were also cementing its position as a dominant cultural and political force. The daily life within this emerging institution, the routines of the scholars, the work of the librarians and scribes, the very process of acquiring and organizing this ocean of papyrus, that's the journey we are about to embark upon. The air is already thick with the promise of discovery, the scent of old scrolls and the quiet, intense hum of minds at work, all dedicated to fulfilling that audacious Ptolemaic dream. Okay, I understand. You'd like the next 5 sections of Whispers from Papyrus Daily Life in the Great Library of Alexandria? From Section 2 through Section 6 delivered in one continuous response, we'll continue our journey, delving deeper into how this legendary institution was built and how life unfolded within its scholarly embrace. You're standing in the vibrant, sun-drenched city of Alexandria, the air alive with the promise of discovery, the scent of papyrus just beginning to permeate the royal quarter. The dream of the Mausion and its great library is taking root. But such a monumental undertaking doesn't just spring into existence. It requires vision, resources, and unwavering royal backing. And that backing comes, in spades, from the new rulers of Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty. Starting with Ptolemy the Younger, a canny general who served under Alexander the Great, and after Alexander's untimely death in 323 BCE, cleverly carved out Egypt as his own rich kingdom. It's his ambition, and that of his successors, that truly fuels the quest to build not just a library, but the world's preeminent beacon of knowledge. Ptolemy the Younger, who reigned from 305 to 282 BCE, wasn't just a military man. He was also a cultured individual with a genuine respect for Greek learning and a keen understanding of how cultural prestige could bolster political power. A key historical fact is that he is widely credited with initiating the project of the Mausoleum and the library, likely advised by the exiled Athenian scholar and statesman Demetrius of Phalerum. Demetrius, a student of Aristotle's school, the Lyceum in Athens, reportedly envisioned a new intellectual center in Alexandria that would rival and even surpass Athens itself. He knew that to attract the greatest minds, you needed more than just a pleasant climate. You needed resources. And above all, you needed books. or rather, scrolls. Lots and lots of scrolls, and it's like he told Ptolemy, look, fill. If you build it and fill it with every scroll known to man, they will come. And they'll sing your praises, and your enemies will be super jealous of your massive collection of literature. The Ptolemaic rulers who followed, particularly Ptolemy II, Philadelphus reigned 284 to 246 BCE, and Ptolemy III Euergetes reigned 266 222 BCE, embraced this vision with even greater fervor and deeper pockets. For them, the library wasn't just a vanity project, it was a strategic investment. It attracted scholars, scientists, poets, and physicians from across the Hellenistic world, bringing prestige, innovation, and skilled personnel to their capital city. It also served as a powerful symbol of Ptolemaic legitimacy and their claim to be the true inheritors of Greek culture and Alexander's imperial legacy. Each scroll added to the collection was another jewel in their cultural crown, another testament to Alexandria's supremacy as the intellectual center of the Mediterranean. They weren't just collecting texts, they were collecting the world's intellectual capital. This royal patronage was comprehensive. The Ptolemies provided generous funding for the construction of the Mausion complex, for the acquisition of scrolls, and for the stipends, free meals, and tax exemptions enjoyed by the resident scholars. It was an incredibly attractive package. Imagine being a brilliant but perhaps impoverished poet from Rhodes or a mathematician from Syracuse, and you receive an invitation come to Alexandria. We'll give you a comfortable place to live, all the papyrus you can write on, access to an unparalleled collection of texts, stimulating company, and you don't even have to worry about your grocery bill. It's the ancient equivalent of a fully funded lifetime MacArthur Genius Grant. But with better weather and more readily available figs, the ambition was truly to gather all the world's knowledge under one roof, or at least within one sprawling complex. This meant not just collecting existing Greek texts, the works of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the great dramatists, but also actively seeking out and translating important works from other cultures, Egyptian religious and scientific texts, Jewish scriptures leading to the legendary creation of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, supposedly undertaken in Alexandria, and perhaps even works from further afield, like India or Persia, if they could be obtained. The Ptolemies wanted their library to be a microcosm of global wisdom, all curated and studied through a Hellenistic lens. Of course, a quirky and rather telling tidbit about the Ptolemaic drive for collection is the story that Ptolemy III Euergetes decreed that all books found on ships docking in Alexandria's harbor were to be seized. The originals were then copied by library scribes. The newly made copies were given back to the owners, and the originals were kept for the library, often with a note saying, "From the ships." It's a rather high-handed approach to acquisitions. Thanks for stopping by Alexandria. We'll just be confiscating your entire onboard library for archival purposes. Here's a lovely souvenir copy. Do come again. But it illustrates the almost obsessive zeal with which they pursued their goal of comprehensive collection. Historians still debate the exact motivations behind this intense royal patronage. Was it purely a love of learning and a desire to preserve knowledge for posterity? Was it primarily a tool of statecraft, designed to enhance Alexandria's prestige and attract talent? Or was it a more personal dynastic ambition, a way for these Greek Macedonian rulers to legitimize their rule over an ancient Egyptian land by becoming the ultimate patrons of Hellenic culture? It was almost certainly a potent blend of all these factors. The Ptolemies were astute rulers who understood that soft power, cultural and intellectual dominance, could be just as effective as military might in building and maintaining an empire. The result of this sustained royal vision and investment was the creation of an institution unlike anything the world had seen before. The Great Library of Alexandria, fueled by Ptolemaic ambition and resources, became a legendary center of scholarship, a beacon that drew intellectuals like moths to a brilliant flame, and a repository of ancient wisdom whose loss is still lamented today. The daily life within its walls, the buzz of debate, the rustle of papyrus, the quiet labor of scholars and scribes, all of it was made possible by this foundational dream of kings who sought to build not just a city, but an empire of the mind. The royal decree has gone forth from the Ptolemaic palace, gather all the world's knowledge. It's a breathtakingly ambitious command, and you, as an imaginary agent or librarian working for the Great Library of Alexandria, are now tasked with a truly monumental global scroll hunt. This isn't like a casual trip to your local antiquarian bookstore. This is an organized, royally funded, and sometimes ruthlessly pursued campaign to acquire every significant text from every corner of the known world. The daily life of the library's acquisitions department, if we can call it that, must have been a whirlwind of correspondence, negotiation, and occasionally, some rather cunning maneuvers. How did they even begin to tackle such a colossal task? The Ptolemies threw the full weight of their royal treasury and their extensive diplomatic and commercial networks behind the effort. Official agents were dispatched throughout the Hellenistic world, to Athens, Rhodes, Pergamum, and other centers of Greek learning, with instructions to buy or copy any important manuscripts they could find. They would have carried letters of introduction from the Ptolemaic court and hefty purses of silver to smooth their way. Imagine being a bookseller in Athens and having an envoy from the king of Egypt walk in, essentially saying, "I'll take one of everything. Please, and don't skimp on the Homer." It would have been a bookseller's dream, and perhaps a logistical nightmare. The focus wasn't just on acquiring famous works. The aim was comprehensiveness. They wanted different editions of the same text, commentaries on classical authors, obscure philosophical treatises, and in anything else that might contribute to the sum of human knowledge. A key historical fact is that the Ptolemies were particularly keen on acquiring authoritative copies of the great Greek literary works, especially the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. One famous and rather notorious story illustrates their methods. Ptolemy III. Euergetes supposedly borrowed the official state copies of these tragic playwrights from Athens, promising a large sum of money as a security deposit for their safe return. He then had his scribes in Alexandria meticulously copy them onto the finest papyrus. When the time came to return the originals, he reportedly sent back the beautiful new copies and cheerfully forfeited his hefty deposit, keeping the precious originals for the Great Library. Athens was apparently not amused by this royal literary heist, but what could they do against the might of Egypt? It was the ancient equivalent of a very high-stakes library fine, or perhaps more accurately, state-sponsored intellectual property theft. "Oh, you wanted these old scrolls back. Our sincerest apologies. There seems to have been a mix-up. But look, we made you these lovely new ones, keep the change." Then there was the infamous ships policy we touched upon earlier. Every vessel, Greek or foreign, that docked in Alexandria's bustling harbor was, by royal decree, to be searched for books. Any scrolls found were confiscated and taken to the library. There, a decision would be made. If the library already possessed a copy, the original might be returned or perhaps a copy given back. If it was a new text, or a better edition of an existing one, the original was accessioned into the library's collection, and a fresh copy made by the library's scribes was given to the unfortunate owner as a replacement. While this sounds rather dictatorial to our modern ears, imagine customs officials seizing your Kindle at the airport to copy your ebooks. It was an incredibly effective, if somewhat aggressive way of ensuring that Alexandria became a central clearinghouse for texts from all over the Mediterranean world and beyond. The port of Alexandria wasn't just a hub for grain and spices, it was a giant, involuntary book drop. The agents of the library would also have been active in manuscript markets, outbidding rivals and sometimes paying exorbitant prices for rare or important scrolls. They might have employed spies or informants to alert them to private collections that could be acquired, either through purchase or persuasion. Oh, a quirky, though less substantiated, Tidbit is the idea that some collectors or even rival states might have tried to pass off forgeries or heavily edited copies to the Alexandrian agents, hoping to either make a quick profit or to subtly sabotage the library's claim to universal knowledge. The authentication and critical evaluation of incoming scrolls must have been a significant and challenging part of the acquisition process for the library's scholars. Is this really a lost dialogue of Plato? Or is it just a very convincing fan fiction written by some clever chap in Corinth? Beyond Greek texts, the Ptolemies also invested in acquiring and translating works from other cultures. The most famous example of this is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, which, according to legend, was commissioned by Ptolemy II Philadelphus and carried out in Alexandria by 72 Jewish scholars. While the historical details of its creation are debated by scholars, was it a single royal commission or a more gradual process driven by the needs of Alexandria's large Greek-speaking Jewish community? The existence of this major translation project underscores the library's ambition to be a multilingual repository of wisdom. Efforts were also likely made to collect and translate important Egyptian texts, preserving ancient pharaonic knowledge, though these would have been primarily for the use of Greek-speaking scholars. The sheer logistics of this global scroll hunt are staggering to contemplate. Imagine the papyrus needed, the ink, the armies of scribes required just to process, copy, and catalog the incoming flood of material. The library wasn't just a passive recipient, it was an active driving force, a vacuum cleaner of ancient texts, fueled by royal wealth and an almost obsessive desire for completeness. The daily life of those involved in acquisitions must have been a constant whirl of travel, negotiation, scholarly assessment, and the careful handling of fragile, precious scrolls, all contributing to the growth of this unparalleled wonder of the ancient intellectual world. You've seen the royal vision, the almost obsessive drive to gather the world's knowledge within the gleaming white walls of Alexandria. But what was it actually like to be one of the fortunate few, one of the intellectual elite, chosen to live and work within the hallowed precincts of the Mouseion and its great library? For these scholars, poets, scientists, and philosophers, life in Ptolemaic Alexandria offered an unprecedented combination of intellectual freedom, financial security, and access to unparalleled resources. However, this scholarly haven wasn't without its own unique pressures, expectations, and occasional royal meddling. It was, in many ways, an academic paradise, but even paradise can have its little quirks and power plays. First, let's talk about the perks. Because they were considerable, the Ptolemaic rulers, starting with Ptolemy the Soter and continuing with his successors, understood that to attract the best minds from across the Hellenistic world, they needed to offer more than just a nice library card. Scholars invited to become members of the Mouseion were provided with a generous state-funded stipend, essentially a salary that freed them from the need to earn a living through teaching fees or other means. They were given free board and lodging, often within the Mouseion complex itself or in nearby residences. They dined together in a communal hall, fostering a sense of intellectual community, and, crucially, they were exempt from taxes. This was a pretty sweet deal, the ancient equivalent of a tenured professorship with a fantastic benefits package, a private chef, and no undergraduate essays to grade. Oh, you're still struggling to pay rent in Athens. Plato Jr., I'm off to the Mouseion, free figs, endless scrolls, and fascinating dinner conversation with Eratosthenes about the Earth's shadow. Do try to keep up. This financial security and freedom from mundane concerns were intended to allow these scholars to dedicate themselves entirely to their research, writing, and intellectual pursuits. And what pursuits they were. The Mouseion wasn't just a library, it was a vibrant center for all branches of learning. Mathematicians like Euclid, who famously compiled his Elements of Geometry there, would have been rubbing shoulders with astronomers like Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric model of the universe centuries before Copernicus. Physicians like Herophilus and Erasistratus, pioneers of human anatomy who controversially, and according to some accounts, performed vivisections on condemned criminals. a grim historical fact, conducted their groundbreaking medical research. Poets like Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes debated literary theory and crafted new epics. Historians, geographers, engineers, grammarians. The intellectual ferment must have been intoxicating. The daily life of a scholar at the Mouseion would likely have involved a rhythm of reading, research, writing, teaching though primarily at an advanced graduate level, often mentoring younger scholars or members of the royal family, and, importantly, vigorous debate and discussion with colleagues. The covered walkways, the lecture halls, the communal dining room, these would have been alive with intellectual sparring, the sharing of new ideas, and the critical examination of ancient texts. Imagine sitting in on a lunchtime debate between a Stoic philosopher, an Epicurean, and a skeptic, all fueled by good Egyptian wine and the latest papyrus acquisitions. The intellectual sparks must have flown. However, this scholarly idyll was not without its pressures. The Ptolemaic patrons, while generous, also expected results. They wanted their Mouseion to produce new knowledge, to enhance Alexandria's reputation, and perhaps even to provide practical benefits to the kingdom. Better medical practices, improved engineering, more accurate maps, or even more compelling royal propaganda in the form of laudatory poetry and histories. There was likely a subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, pressure to publish, to contribute, to justify one's stipend. Failure to produce or falling out of royal favor could lead to a swift and unwelcome termination of one's membership in this exclusive club. It's like having the world's best research grant, but knowing your patron king occasionally downsizes his intellectual investments with extreme prejudice. A quirky and somewhat cynical tidbit comes from the writer Timon of Phlius, a contemporary skeptic philosopher who is apparently unimpressed by the pampered scholars of the Mouseion. He described them as well-jargoned scribblers who get their living in the muse's birdcage, pecking at each other in endless, futile debate. This paints a less romantic picture, suggesting that even in this intellectual paradise, academic rivalries, petty jealousies, and perhaps a degree of scholarly navel-gazing could thrive. Human nature, it seems, is remarkably consistent across the millennia. Furthermore, the scholars were, to some extent, living in a gilded cage. Their freedom was dependent on royal whim. If a ruler took a dislike to a particular scholar or their ideas, or if political winds shifted, a comfortable position could quickly become a precarious one. There are accounts of scholars being exiled, imprisoned, or worse, for offending the reigning Ptolemy. Historians still debate the true extent of intellectual freedom within the Mouseion. Were scholars genuinely free to pursue any line of inquiry, even if it challenged established norms or royal policy? Or was there an implicit or explicit understanding that certain topics were best avoided, and that royal patronage came with certain unwritten expectations of loyalty and intellectual conformity? At least in politically sensitive areas, it was likely a delicate balance. The Ptolemies wanted brilliant minds, but they probably preferred brilliant minds that didn't ask too many awkward questions about, say, the legitimacy of their rule over Egypt. Despite these pressures and potential pitfalls, for many scholars, the opportunity to live and work at the Mouseion, with the unparalleled resources of the Great Library at their fingertips, must have been the pinnacle of their careers. It was a chance to be part of a unique, vibrant intellectual community, to contribute to the sum of human knowledge, and to engage with the past and shape the future, all under the warm Egyptian sun, surrounded by the whispers of countless papyrus scrolls. You've got this ever-expanding ocean of papyrus scrolls flooding into Alexandria, thanks to the Ptolemies' insatiable appetite for knowledge, and perhaps a bit of intellectual kleptomania with that ship's library policy. The Great Library is becoming a truly monumental collection, a testament to human thought from across the known world. But now you face a problem that would make even the most dedicated modern librarian break out in a cold sweat. How on earth do you organize and make sense of hundreds of thousands of individual scrolls, especially when many of them lack standardized titles, author attributions, or even clear subject categories? This is where the daily life of the library shifts from acquisition to the Herculean task of bibliographic control. And one name stands out in this monumental endeavor: Callimachus of Cyrene. Imagine the scene inside the storage areas of the library. Shelves upon shelves, niches upon niches, all crammed with papyrus rolls of varying lengths and thicknesses. Some are neatly labeled with little wooden or ivory tags silly boy indicating their contents, but many more are simply anonymous cylinders of varying provenance. Finding a specific work, or even knowing what works the library possessed on a particular subject, would have been an almost impossible task without some system of organization. It's like having the entire internet downloaded onto individual, unlabeled toilet paper rolls and then trying to find a specific cat video. Good luck with that. Enter Callimachus, a renowned poet and scholar in his own right, active in Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy II. Philadelphus in the 3rd century BCE. Callimachus was one of the most distinguished figures associated with the library. While he may not have held the official title of head librarian, that position was often held by other prominent scholars like Zenodotus or Eratosthenes. He undertook a project of immense bibliographic importance, the creation of the Pnyx Pinnacas, which translates roughly as tables or lists. A key historical fact is that the Pnyx are considered one of the world's earliest and most comprehensive library catalogs, a foundational work in the history of bibliography. This wasn't just a simple list of titles, it was an attempt to systematically organize and describe the entire holdings of the Great Library. The sheer scale of this undertaking is difficult to overstate. Callimachus and his team of assistants, because this was definitely not a one-man job, despite his name being primarily associated with it, had to examine countless scrolls. For each work, they needed to determine, if possible, the author's name, the title which wasn't always clear or consistent in ancient texts, the first few words of the text, the incipit, often used for identification, and sometimes a brief summary of the content or a note on its authenticity or different recensions versions. They then had to classify these works into broad subject categories. According to later summaries of his work as the Pnyx itself, like so much from the library, is now lost. Callimachus divided Greek literature into major genres such as rhetoric, law, epic, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, medicine, mathematics, natural science, and miscellaneous. Within these categories, authors were then typically listed alphabetically. It was a groundbreaking attempt to impose intellectual order on a vast and potentially chaotic universe of knowledge. He was essentially inventing the Dewey Decimal System, but for papyrus scrolls and with a much cooler, more classical-sounding name. Excuse me, where would I find the scrolls on remedies for excessive humors caused by melancholy? Yes, Pnyx classification for... Thank you, Callimachus. The creation of the Pnyces would have involved an immense amount of daily, painstaking labor. Imagine the scholars and scribes unrolling fragile papyrus, deciphering often difficult handwriting, comparing different versions of the same text, debating authorship, and then meticulously recording the information. They would have needed a deep knowledge of Greek literature and scholarship to make these judgments. There would have been dust, the faint smell of aging papyrus, the quiet scratch of reed pens on fresh sheets of papyrus being used for the catalog entries, and undoubtedly, many scholarly arguments about how to classify a particularly tricky philosophical treatise that seemed to straddle multiple genres. Is this a work of ethics, or merely a poorly disguised attempt at political satire with too many footnotes about figs? The Pnyx demands clarity. Demetrius, a quirky and rather telling tidbit is that Callimachus himself famously quipped, "Mega Biblion, mega kakon. A big book is a big evil." This might seem ironic coming from someone cataloging a library filled with very big in the sense of numerous scrolls constituting a single book, or work and very many books. However, it likely reflected his preference for concise, well-crafted, and perhaps more original scholarly or poetic works, rather than long, rambling epics or derivative commentaries. Or maybe after spending years wrestling with hundreds of thousands of scrolls, He was just really tired of big books. The Pinakais, reportedly running to some 120 books or scrolls itself, was more than just an inventory list. It was a critical bibliography, a map of Greek literature and learning as it existed in the Hellenistic world. It helped scholars navigate the library's vast holdings. It preserved information about authors and works that might otherwise have been lost. And it established a framework for literary history and canon formation that would influence scholarship for centuries. Even though the Pnyx itself is gone, our knowledge of its structure and some of its contents, gleaned from later writers who consulted it, gives us an invaluable glimpse into the intellectual organization of the Great Library. Historians and classicists still debate many aspects of the Pnyx. Its precise scope, did it cover only Greek literature, or also translated works, the exact principles of its organization, and how widely it was used by scholars in their daily research. But its importance as a pioneering work of systematic bibliography is undisputed. Callimachus and his team, through their meticulous daily labor, were not just listing scrolls. They were shaping the very understanding of the classical literary heritage, creating order out of a potential papyrus avalanche, and ensuring that the whispers from those ancient scrolls could be heard, found, and understood by generations of scholars to come. You've seen the grand vision of the Ptolemies, the relentless global hunt for scrolls, the privileged lives of the resident scholars, and the monumental effort of Callimachus to catalog the ever-expanding universe of knowledge within the Great Library of Alexandria. But behind these headline acts, behind the famous names like Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Archimedes who walked its colonnaded halls, there was an army of quieter, often anonymous, individuals whose daily labor was absolutely essential to the library's functioning and its very existence. These were the copyists, the scribes, the translators, the editors, the restorers, the ink-stained scroll keepers whose meticulous work formed the backbone of this legendary institution. Their daily life was one of intense concentration, painstaking precision, and a deep, often unsung devotion to the preservation and dissemination of the written word. Imagine yourself stepping into one of the many scriptoria or workshops attached to the library. The air is filled with the characteristic scent of papyrus, a dry, slightly sweet, earthy smell, mixed with the sharper tang of ink and perhaps the subtle aroma of adhesives used for repairs. Unlike the often solitary monk in a medieval European scriptorium we might have pictured earlier, the Alexandrian library's copying operations were likely more akin to a well-organized, almost industrial-scale enterprise, albeit one powered by human hands and eyes. There would be rows of scribes, seated at their desks, each one diligently transcribing a text from an original scroll, the exemplar, onto a fresh roll of papyrus. This wasn't just about making a single backup copy, it was about producing multiple copies for the library's own collection, perhaps a master copy and several reading copies, for exchange with other libraries or scholars, or even for sale to wealthy private collectors, which might have provided some revenue for the library or for the scribes themselves. The process of copying was incredibly demanding. A scribe needed not only legible handwriting, often a clear, professional Greek uncial or cursive script, but also a high degree of accuracy, good eyesight, and immense patience. They would unroll a section of the exemplar with one hand, read a phrase or a line, commit it to memory, and then write it onto the new papyrus roll with a reed pen, kalamos dipped in black ink, usually made from soot or lampblack mixed with gum. Mistakes were inevitable, and correcting them on papyrus was trickier than on parchment. Scraping was less effective, so errors might be crossed out, or the entire section might need to be recopied. You can imagine the quiet frustration of a scribe realizing they've skipped a line or misspelled a crucial philosophical term halfway down a column. By the muses, not again. That's the third time this week I've turned Plato into Ploto. The head librarian will have my hide, or at least my lunch stipend. Beyond straightforward copying, these unsung workers also performed vital editorial tasks. A key historical fact is that the scholars of the Alexandrian library were pioneers in textual criticism. They would compare different manuscript versions of the same work. Remember all those scrolls, borrowed from ships or acquired from various sources, noting variations, identifying errors that had crept in through generations of previous copying, and attempting to establish the most accurate or authentic text of classical authors like Homer, Plato, or the tragic playwrights. This critical editorial work, collating manuscripts, making emendations, adding scholarly notes, scholia in the margins, would then be incorporated into the new copies produced by the library's scribes. So, the scribes weren't just mindlessly duplicating, they were often creating new, improved, and critically edited editions that would become standard text for centuries. Translation was another crucial daily activity. The library's ambition to be a universal repository meant acquiring texts in various languages: Egyptian, Hebrew, perhaps even Persian or Indian. To make these accessible to the predominantly Greek-speaking scholarly community of Alexandria, teams of translators would have been employed. The most famous example, as we've mentioned, is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. This would have involved bilingual or trilingual scholars and scribes working meticulously to render complex religious and literary texts from one linguistic and cultural context into another. Imagine the intense debates about the precise meaning of a particular Hebrew idiom or an Egyptian hieroglyphic phrase, and how best to express it in Koine Greek. A quirky tidbit relates to the physical production and maintenance of the scrolls themselves. Papyrus, while the dominant writing material of the Mediterranean world for millennia, is also quite fragile, susceptible to moisture, insects, and simple wear and tear from repeated rolling and unrolling. The library would have employed staff dedicated to repairing damaged scrolls, perhaps patching tears with fresh strips of papyrus, re-inking faded passages, or even reattaching broken sections. They would also have been responsible for preparing new papyrus rolls for the scribes, cutting the sheets to standard sizes, and perhaps treating the surface to make it smoother for writing. It was a constant battle against decay, a daily effort to preserve these precious, brittle vessels of knowledge. They were the original paper conservationists, working without the benefit of modern archival science, relying on skill, patience, and probably some very carefully guarded trade secrets for adhesives and pest control. Oh look, another scroll nibbled by a bookworm. That's the third one this month. We really need to have a word with Ptolemy about investing in some better quality royal cats for pest control in the scroll stacks. You're now deeply immersed in the world of the Great Library of Alexandria, surrounded by the rustle of papyrus and the quiet hum of intellectual endeavor. We've seen how the scrolls were gathered, cataloged, and meticulously copied. But the library wasn't just a passive repository of texts, it was a vibrant crucible of new ideas. A place where some of the most brilliant minds of the Hellenistic age lived, worked, debated, and made discoveries that would resonate for centuries. As you wander its imagined colonnades and lecture halls, you're walking in the footsteps of giants, the echoes of whose genius still whisper to us from the fragments of their lost works and the enduring impact of their breakthroughs. One of the earliest and most legendary figures associated with the Mausoleum and its library is Euclid, often hailed as the father of geometry. Active in Alexandria probably during the reign of Ptolemy, far Soter early 3rd century BCE, Euclid compiled his monumental work, The Elements, within this scholarly haven. A key historical fact: Euclid's Elements is one of the most influential works in the history of mathematics, serving as the main textbook for teaching geometry from its publication until the late 19th or early 20th century. It's a masterpiece of logical deduction, starting from a small set of axioms and postulates and systematically deriving a vast body of geometric theorems. Imagine Euclid, perhaps a quiet, intensely focused man, surrounded by diagrams drawn in the sand or on wax tablets, meticulously organizing centuries of Greek mathematical thought into a coherent, rigorous system. His work wasn't necessarily all original discovery, but his genius lay in its logical arrangement and irrefutable proofs. You can almost hear a student muttering, Another cute D from Master Euclid. Does the man ever just say, because it looks right? Probably not. Then there's Eratosthenes of Cyrene, a true polymath who flourished in Alexandria a generation or so after Euclid, serving as head librarian from about 245 BCE to 194 BCE. Eratosthenes was a geographer, mathematician, astronomer, historian, poet, and philologist. Basically, the ancient world's Swiss Army knife of intellect. He's most famous for his remarkably accurate calculation of the circumference of the Earth, using simple geometry and observations of the sun's angle at two different Egyptian locations, Alexandria and Syene. Modern Aswan on the summer solstice, he came up with a figure that was astonishingly close to the actual value. Imagine him, perhaps using the library's resources to find records of distances between cities, or consulting astronomical tables, piecing together the clues to measure our planet. It was a feat of brilliant deduction and empirical observation. He also created a system of longitude and latitude, attempted to fix the dates of major historical events chronography, and wrote extensively on many subjects. Though, sadly, most of his works are now lost, known only through later summaries and fragments. He was nicknamed Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, supposedly because he was considered the second best in many different fields. A quirky tidbit that sounds like a bit of a backhanded compliment. But given the caliber of minds in Alexandria, being second best was still pretty phenomenal. Oh, Eratosthenes' brilliant chap. Not quite Plato in philosophy, not quite Homer in poetry, but a solid beta across the board. And he only measured the entire planet. So, not bad for a Tuesday. Another towering intellect associated with Alexandria, though he may have studied there rather than being a permanent member of the Mouseion, was Archimedes of Syracuse, the great mathematician, physicist, engineer, and inventor. While his most famous eureka moment in the bathtub happened in Sicily, his connections to Alexandrian scholarship, particularly in mathematics, were strong. He corresponded with scholars there, like Eratosthenes and Conon of Samos, and his works on geometry, mechanics, and hydrostatics would certainly have been prized possessions in the Great Library, studied and debated by its resident mathematicians. And we mustn't forget the literary scholars and poets. Callimachus, whom we met as the Great Cataloger, was also a highly influential poet and literary critic, a leading figure of Hellenistic poetry. He championed a style of learned, elusive, and polished verse. He famously clashed, intellectually at least, with his one-time student Apollonius of Rhodes, another prominent poet and, for a time, head librarian, who wrote the epic poem Argonautica. Nashe, their debates about the nature of epic poetry in a sophisticated post-classical age would have enlivened the literary discussions within the Mouseion. The medical school at Alexandria was also renowned. Physicians like Herophilus and Erasistratus, as mentioned, made groundbreaking advances in anatomy and physiology, reputedly through human dissection and perhaps even vivisection, a deeply controversial practice then and now. Their detailed anatomical studies, though many of their writings are lost, significantly advanced medical understanding. Historians continue to debate the exact nature of the discoveries made at Alexandria. Was it primarily a center for compiling, editing, and preserving existing knowledge from the classical Greek past, or was it also a hotbed of truly original research and scientific innovation? The answer, as with most things, is likely a bit of both. The scholars of Alexandria were certainly deeply engaged with the heritage of the past, but figures like Eratosthenes and the medical pioneers clearly pushed the boundaries of knowledge in their respective fields. The daily life of these great minds would have been one of intense intellectual immersion. Access to the vast collection of scrolls, the freedom from financial worries, the constant stimulation of debate with brilliant colleagues from diverse disciplines. It was an environment designed to foster thought and discovery. The echoes of their genius, their arguments, their calculations, and their poetic verses, all once contained on fragile papyrus, have in many cases faded or been lost. but their impact on the trajectory of Western science, mathematics, and literature is undeniable. You are walking among the ghosts of some of the ancient world's most luminous intellects. You've met some of the intellectual giants who called the Mouseion and its great library home. But what would a typical day actually feel like if you were one of those scholars, or even just a visiting researcher fortunate enough to gain access to this unparalleled sanctuary of scrolls in ancient Alexandria? Let's try to imagine it. To breathe in the papyrus-scented air and listen to the quiet rustle of knowledge being unfurled. It's a day steeped in reading, research, discussion, and the unique rhythms of a life dedicated to learning, all under the warm Egyptian sun and the generous, if sometimes watchful, patronage of the Ptolemies. Your day might begin early, perhaps with the sounds of the bustling city of Alexandria slowly filtering into your quarters within the Mouseion complex, or in a nearby residence provided for scholars. After a simple breakfast, maybe some bread, olives, figs, and a cup of diluted wine, the typical Mediterranean fare, you would make your way to the library proper. As you walk through the colonnaded peripatoi, the covered walkways that connected the various buildings of the Mouseion, you might see fellow scholars already engaged in animated discussion. Perhaps a philosopher heatedly debating a point of ethics with a colleague, or a poet reciting his latest verses to a critical, if appreciative, audience. There's a palpable buzz of intellectual energy, a sense that important work is being done here. You're not just going to an office, you're entering a temple of human thought. Morning, Aristarchus. Still trying to convince everyone the earth goes around the sun. Bold move. My friend, bold move. Ptolemy III is asking about your horoscopes later. By the way, so maybe stick to less controversial topics over lunch. Once inside the library's main halls or one of its many reading rooms, the sheer scale of the collection would be awe-inspiring. Imagine vast halls lined with thousands upon thousands of pigeonholes or shelves armoria, each filled with papyrus scrolls, neatly tied and labeled with little wooden or ivory tags called syllaboi, singular syllabos indicating their author and title. The air would carry that distinctive dry, slightly sweet, earthy scent of aging papyrus, perhaps mingled with the faintest trace of cedar oil, which was sometimes used as a preservative to deter bookworms and other pests. It's a smell that whispers of antiquity, of countless hours of human thought captured on fragile rolls. You wouldn't just be grabbing a book off a shelf. Accessing a scroll was a more deliberate process. First, you'd likely need to consult the Pinnakeys, Callimachus's great catalog, or perhaps a more specialized subject index to identify the specific work you needed. This might involve conferring with one of the assistant librarians or scribes who were experts in navigating the collection. A historical fact, the library was meticulously organized, with different sections likely dedicated to different genres like poetry, philosophy, history, medicine, and mathematics. Once you've identified your scroll, a library attendant, perhaps a junior scholar or a trusted servant, would retrieve it for you from its designated storage place. There was probably no self-service checkout for these precious, often unique or master copy scrolls. You'd then unroll the papyrus scroll carefully on a lectern or a reading desk. Reading a scroll is a two-handed operation. You unroll it from one side with one hand, and roll it up on the other side with your other hand as you progress through the text, which was written in columns. It requires a certain dexterity and care, especially with older, more brittle scrolls. You might be making notes on a wax tablet with a stylus, or perhaps on a cheaper sheet of practice papyrus, as fresh, high-quality papyrus for extensive note-taking would still be a valuable commodity. You wouldn't be highlighting your scroll with a bright yellow marker. That's for sure. Probably get you banned for life, or at least a very stern talking to from the head librarian. For the love of Zeus, Philo. That's a first edition Homer. Treat it with some respect, or it's back to counting pigeons in the courtyard for you. Throughout the day, the library would be a hive of quiet activity. Scholars poring over texts, comparing different editions, making critical annotations in the margins of their own working copies, or dictating new compositions to their personal scribes. There would be lectures in designated halls, where a senior scholar might expound on a classical author or present his latest scientific findings. Smaller groups might gather in alcoves or gardens for more informal discussions and debates. A quirky tidbit, it said that the Mausion had a communal dining hall where all the resident scholars ate together. These mealtimes would have been lively affairs, filled with intellectual sparring, academic gossip, and perhaps the occasional grumble about the quality of the state-funded lentils or the stinginess of the latest royal wine ration. The library wasn't just a place for solitary study, it was a collaborative environment. Scholars would consult each other, share their research, and build upon each other's work. A mathematician might seek out a philologist to help decipher an obscure term in an ancient text. A physician might consult an astronomer about the influence of celestial bodies on health. According to the prevailing theories, historians still debate the exact level of access that outsiders or junior students had to the Great Library's main collection. Was it primarily reserved for the elite, royally appointed scholars of the Mausion, or was it more broadly accessible to other educated individuals in Alexandria? There was also the daughter library at the Serapeum Temple, which may have served a more public function. Regardless, for those within its privileged embrace, a day at the Great Library of Alexandria was an immersion in the totality of human knowledge as it then existed, a chance to converse with the great minds of the past through their writings, and to contribute, in some small or large way, to the ongoing intellectual adventure of humankind. It was a daily life dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom, surrounded by the rustling whispers of countless papyrus scrolls. The Great Library and its parent institution, the Mausion, might seem like an ivory tower, a secluded haven for scholars deep in their papyrus scrolls, far removed from the hustle and bustle of everyday Alexandrian life. But you'd be mistaken to think of it as completely detached, while it certainly cultivated an atmosphere of intense intellectual focus. This Temple of the Muses was deeply embedded within the vibrant, multicultural, and commercially thriving city that surrounded it. Its daily life was subtly, and sometimes directly, intertwined with the rhythms of Alexandria itself, drawing sustenance from the city and, in turn, contributing to its unique character and global reputation. Imagine stepping out from the relatively tranquil colonnades of the Mausion into the wide, sun-drenched streets of Alexandria. The contrast would be immediate. The city, as we've noted, was a true Hellenistic metropolis, a melting pot of cultures. Greek was the language of administration and scholarship, but you'd hear Egyptian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, and a dozen other tongues spoken in the bustling marketplaces and along the quays of its magnificent double harbor. The library, with its ambition to collect texts in all languages, even if primarily translating them into Greek for its scholars, would have been acutely aware of this linguistic diversity. Its agents and scribes would have needed to interact with these different communities to acquire and understand non-Greek texts. Perhaps a Jewish scholar from Alexandria's large and influential Jewish quarter would be consulted for help with Hebrew scriptures, or an Egyptian priest might be called upon to decipher an ancient hieroglyphic text. The library wasn't just importing scrolls, it was importing linguistic and cultural expertise from the city around it. The port of Alexandria was the city's economic engine, a nexus of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world with Egypt's Nile Valley, the Red Sea, and even distant India. Remember that royal decree about seizing all books from ships docking in the harbor? This policy directly linked the daily commercial life of the port with the library's insatiable hunger for acquisitions. Every ship that arrived, laden with grain, wine, spices, or luxury goods, was also a potential carrier of new intellectual treasures for the library's shelves. You can picture library agents, perhaps with a detachment of royal guards, diligently meeting incoming vessels. Their eyes peeled not for contraband, but for uncatalogued classics or rare philosophical treatises. Welcome to Alexandria. Captain Lovely weather we're having. Now, about that intriguing-looking chest of papyrus you have in your hold. Mind if we take a peek for the royal collection? The presence of so many scholars, students, and visiting intellectuals drawn to the library and Mausion also had a direct economic impact on the city. They needed lodging if not housed directly in the Mausion, food, clothing, writing materials, papyrus, ink, style, and other services. This created a microeconomy around the scholarly quarter. Booksellers dealing in newly copied texts or perhaps secondhand scrolls, skilled artisans producing quality papyrus and pens, and even specialized food vendors catering to the tastes of a diverse academic community would have thrived. A key historical fact is that Alexandria was a major center for papyrus production, thanks to the abundant papyrus reeds growing in the Nile Delta. The library would have been a massive consumer of this product, and the industry that supplied it was a significant part of the local Egyptian economy. Furthermore, the knowledge generated within the library and Mausion wasn't always confined to its walls. While much of the research was esoteric, some had practical applications that could benefit the city and the kingdom. Advances in engineering, perhaps inspired by figures like Archimedes or Ctesibius, who is credited with inventing various hydraulic and pneumatic devices, could be applied to civic works, irrigation, or even military technology. Medical knowledge developed by Alexandrian physicians like Herophilus and Erasistratus, particularly their anatomical studies, would have influenced medical practice in the city, at least for those who could afford a learned doctor. Geographical knowledge, compiled and refined by scholars like Eratosthenes, was vital for trade and navigation. The library wasn't just an archive, it was, in some respects, an ancient R&D department for the Ptolemaic state and the city of Alexandria. A quirky tidbit: the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, itself an engineering marvel, might have had a more direct connection to the library than just being a famous landmark. Some later, perhaps romanticized, accounts suggest that mirrors or lenses from the Pharos were used for astronomical observations, or even more fancifully, to burn enemy ships at sea. While the ship burning is almost certainly a legend, the idea of practical science and grand engineering existing side by side with the library's textual scholarship is very much in keeping with Alexandria's spirit. Historians continue to debate the extent to which the highly specialized, Greek-dominated intellectual life of the Mauseon truly permeated the daily consciousness of Alexandria's diverse, multilingual population. Was there a significant cultural gap between the elite scholars in their birdcage of the muses and the bustling commercial life of the ordinary Alexandrian citizen? Undoubtedly, to some extent. However, the library was not an isolated fortress. It was a prominent feature of a city that prided itself on its learning and culture. Public lectures, festivals, and the sheer presence of so many notable thinkers would have contributed to Alexandria's reputation as a unique intellectual hub, influencing its atmosphere and attracting visitors, students, and immigrants from across the Hellenistic world. The city and the scroll were in a constant, dynamic interplay, each shaping and being shaped by the other, creating a vibrant nexus of knowledge, commerce, and culture on the shores of the Mediterranean. You're comfortably ensconced in the scholarly world of Alexandria, where the Ptolemies are pouring resources into making their great library the undisputed champion of global knowledge. But Alexandria, for all its grandeur, wasn't the only city with a library. Nor were the Ptolemies the only Hellenistic rulers with a penchant for collecting scrolls and patronizing scholars. The quest for knowledge and the prestige that came with it was a competitive sport in the ancient world, leading to some fascinating and sometimes rather cutthroat papyrus politics and rivalries between intellectual centers. The most significant of these rivalries was with the Attalid kingdom of Pergamum in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, which also boasted a magnificent library that aimed to challenge Alexandria's supremacy. Imagine the scene: two heavyweight intellectual champions, Alexandria and Pergamum, eyeing each other across the Aegean Sea, both desperately trying to acquire the rarest texts, attract the most brilliant scholars, and build the most comprehensive collection. It was the ancient world's version of a Cold War fought not with weapons, but with papyrus rolls and competitive salaries for philosophers. A key historical fact is that the Library of Pergamum, founded by King Eumenes II in the 2nd century BCE, was deliberately modeled on Alexandria's, and it grew to be its most serious competitor, reportedly amassing hundreds of thousands of scrolls itself. This rivalry spurred both institutions to new heights of acquisition and scholarship, but it also led to some rather interesting and occasionally underhanded tactics. You can almost hear the librarians muttering, "Blast those Pergamines. They just outbid us for that lost play of Sophocles. Ptolemy will not be pleased. Someone send out more agents and tell them the budget just doubled. Or else, one of the most famous stories illustrating this papyrus politics concerns the very material upon which all this knowledge was written. Papyrus itself. Papyrus reeds grew abundantly in Egypt, giving the Ptolemies a virtual monopoly on the production and export of this essential writing material. According to the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, when the Library of Pergamum began to seriously challenge Alexandria's dominance, one of the Ptolemies, traditionally Ptolemy V Epiphanes, though the exact ruler and date are debated, supposedly placed an embargo on the export of papyrus to Pergamum, hoping to stifle his rival's library-building efforts. It was a strategic move, like cutting off your competitor's supply of essential raw materials. Oh, you want to build a bigger library than ours? Eumenes. Good luck doing that without any actual paper, or, well, papyrus. Enjoy your clay tablets. This alleged papyrus embargo, a quirky tidbit of ancient library lore, is said to have had an unintended but hugely significant consequence. It spurred the Pergamines to perfect and promote an alternative writing material, parchment. Parchment, made from treated animal skins, sheep, goat, calf, had been around for centuries, but Pergamum is credited with greatly improving its quality and popularizing its use, to the extent that the very word parchment is derived from pergamum via the Latin pergamina. Parchment was more durable than papyrus, could be made in larger sheets, and importantly, could be produced anywhere there were animals, thus breaking Egypt's papyrus monopoly. So, in a classic case of unintended consequences, Ptolemy's attempt to throttle Pergamum's library may have inadvertently accelerated the adoption of a superior, longer-lasting writing material that would eventually supplant papyrus throughout much of Europe. Oops. Beyond material one-upmanship, the rivalry also played out in the competition for scholars. Both Alexandria and Pergamum offered attractive stipends and working conditions to lure the best poets, historians, scientists, and grammarians. A famous scholar might find himself courted by envoys from both cities, each trying to outbid the other for his services. This could lead to some rather awkward situations, and perhaps a few inflated scholarly egos. Well, Eratosthenes, Alexandria is offering me free figs and a view of the harbor. What can Pergamum offer to top that a slightly less grumpy king? Perhaps this competition wasn't just between Alexandria and Pergamum. Other Hellenistic rulers and wealthy cities also established significant libraries, though none quite matched the scale of the big two. There were important collections in Athens, Rhodes, Antioch, and elsewhere. The acquisition of texts was a constant concern for all of them. Royal edicts, like Ptolemy III's decree to seize books from ships in Alexandria, were one rather forceful method. Another was simply outbidding everyone else in the manuscript markets of the Greek world. And sometimes it involved more subtle diplomacy, or even, according to some less substantiated tales, outright theft or the permanent borrowing of unique manuscripts from smaller, less powerful collections. Historians still debate the true extent and ferocity of the Alexandria-Pergamum library rivalry. Were they truly locked in a bitter, no-holds-barred papyrus war? Or was it a more gentlemanly, if still competitive, pursuit of scholarly excellence? The ancient sources, often prone to exaggeration and bias, give us tantalizing glimpses, but not always the full picture. What is clear is that this competitive environment, fueled by royal patronage and civic pride, was a powerful stimulus for the collection, preservation, and study of ancient texts on an unprecedented scale. The daily life of a librarian or acquisitions agent during this period must have been a thrilling, if occasionally stressful, game of chasing down rare scrolls outmaneuvering rivals, and ensuring their own library stayed at the top of the Hellenistic intellectual league tables. The politics of Papyrus were as complex and shifting as the desert sands. You're comfortably settled into the rhythm of the Great Library of Alexandria, surrounded by the whispers of Papyrus and the intellectual buzz of scholars. The Ptolemaic rulers, as we've seen, are the grand patrons, the benefactors whose vision and wealth make this whole extraordinary enterprise possible. They provide the stipends, fund the acquisitions, and bask in the reflected glory of Alexandria's status as the intellectual capital of the world. But royal patronage, as any courtier or scholar throughout history could tell you, is a double-edged sword. While it brings resources and prestige, it also comes with the potential for royal whims, personal interference, and occasionally, outright purges, all of which could profoundly impact the daily lives and intellectual freedom of those toiling within the Mausion's birdcage of the muses. On the positive side, the sustained commitment of the early Ptolemies, Soter, Philadelphus, Euergetes, was undeniably the bedrock upon which the library's greatness was built. Their genuine interest in Greek culture, even as they ruled over an Egyptian populace, their competitive desire to outshine other Hellenistic kingdoms, and their understanding of soft power all contributed to an environment where scholarship was, for the most part, highly valued and generously supported. Scholars were generally left to pursue their research, to debate freely at least on non-political topics, and to produce the works that would define Alexandrian learning. Imagine Ptolemy II. Philadelphus, himself a man of considerable intellectual curiosity, perhaps strolling through the Mausion, engaging in conversation with Eratosthenes about the size of the earth, or listening to Callimachus recite his latest elegant verses. This kind of direct royal engagement, when positive, could be incredibly stimulating. Fascinating theory about the earth being round. Eratosthenes, though, are you sure it isn't carried on the back of a giant turtle? My cousin in India swears by it. No, well, more papyrus for your calculations then. However, the relationship between the rulers and the scholars was not always one of harmonious intellectual fellowship. The Ptolemies were, after all, absolute monarchs, ruling a vast and often turbulent kingdom. Their primary concerns were political stability, dynastic succession, and the maintenance of their power. The scholars of the Mausion, for all their intellectual prestige, were ultimately dependent on royal favor. And royal favor, as history repeatedly shows, can be a fickle thing. A change in ruler, a shift in political priorities, or even a personal dislike could have serious consequences for the residents of the Mausion. A key historical fact that illustrates this darker side of royal patronage is the reign of Ptolemy of 8th Euergetes II, often nicknamed Physcon Potbelly, due to his rather unflattering physique and personality. Physcon, who ruled with interruptions and much dynastic strife, in the mid to late 2nd century BCE, was known for his cruelty, his anti-intellectual streak at least compared to his predecessors, and his purges of those he suspected of disloyalty. During his reign, many prominent scholars associated with the Mausion and library were reportedly persecuted, exiled, or even killed. This included figures like Aristarchus of Samothrace, a renowned Homeric scholar and head librarian, who was forced to flee Alexandria. Such purges would have sent a chilling effect through the scholarly community, undoubtedly stifling open debate and discouraging research into any areas that might be deemed politically sensitive. It's hard to focus on deciphering an obscure Greek particle when you're worried the king's guards might burst in and accuse you of seditious grammar. Even before Physcon's more brutal interventions, there would have been subtle pressures. The head librarian, for instance, was a royal appointee, often also serving as a tutor to the royal children. This dual role could create conflicts of interest, and the choice of head librarian might be based as much on political loyalty or courtly favor as on pure scholarly merit. While figures like Zenodotus, Eratosthenes, and Aristophanes of Byzantium were all eminent scholars who made significant contributions, their daily administrative duties and their need to navigate court politics would have been a constant balancing act. Yes, Your Majesty, The new cataloging system for tragic poetry is progressing splendidly. And no, young Prince Ptolemy has not, to my knowledge, been using priceless Homeric scrolls for spitball practice anymore. A quirky and perhaps telling tidbit is that the scholars of the Mosaïon, despite their stipends and free meals, were sometimes mocked by outsiders for being cooped up and out of touch with the real world, entirely dependent on the king's largesse. That jibe from Timon of Phlius about them being well-jargoned scribblers in the muse's birdcage hints at a perception that their intellectual pursuits, however brilliant, were happening in a somewhat artificial, royally controlled environment. The Ptolemies also directly influenced the direction of scholarship. They might commission specific works, histories that glorified their dynasty, poems celebrating royal weddings or military victories, or translations of texts deemed politically or culturally important, like the Septuagint. While such commissions could provide valuable resources and impetus for scholarly projects, they also meant that the intellectual agenda was not entirely driven by the scholars themselves. There was an element of "he who pays the piper calls the tune." Historians still debate the overall impact of Ptolemaic patronage on the intellectual vitality of the library. Did the benefits of generous funding and resources outweigh the constraints imposed by royal oversight and occasional interference? Or did the dependence on royal favor ultimately limit the scope of free inquiry and contribute to a gradual ossification of Alexandrian scholarship in later centuries? It's a complex question with no simple answer. For much of its heyday, the library thrived because of royal support. But that very support also contained the seeds of potential vulnerability. The daily life of a scholar in Alexandria was thus a delicate dance between the pursuit of pure knowledge and the pragmatic need to remain in the good graces of a powerful, and sometimes unpredictable, royal patron. One misstep, one ill-judged comment, one scholarly treatise that inadvertently offended a royal sensitivity, and that comfortable life among the scrolls could vanish very quickly. You're deeply immersed in the world of the Great Library within Alexandria's royal quarter, the Bruchion, a sanctuary of scholarship largely accessible to the elite circle of royally funded academics. But as you wander the bustling, multicultural streets of Alexandria, you become aware that the Ptolemaic thirst for knowledge and their desire to project cultural supremacy wasn't entirely confined to that exclusive enclave. There was another significant, though often overshadowed, repository of scrolls in the city, the library housed within the magnificent temple complex of the Serapeum, often referred to as the Daughter Library. This institution, while connected to its grander parent, had its own distinct character and played a vital role in the intellectual life of Alexandria, perhaps catering to a slightly broader audience and serving different, though complementary, functions. The Serapeum itself was one of Alexandria's most impressive religious sites, dedicated to the syncretic Hellenistic Egyptian god Serapis. This deity, deliberately promoted by the early Ptolemies, was a fusion of the Egyptian god Osiris Apis and various Greek gods like Zeus, Hades, and Asclepius, designed to appeal to both the Greek and Egyptian populations of their kingdom and foster a sense of shared religious identity. The temple complex, located on a raised acropolis in a different part of the city from the royal quarter in the Rhakotis district. The older Egyptian part of town was a monumental structure, famed for its architectural grandeur and its religious significance. A key historical fact is that the Serapeum, with its associated library, was likely founded by Ptolemy III Euergetes in the 3rd century BCE, somewhat later than the main royal library, perhaps as an extension or an overflow facility, or with a slightly different purpose in mind. It wasn't just a storage annex, it was an intellectual center in its own right, nestled within a major religious sanctuary. What was the role of this daughter library? While the main royal library was primarily a research institution for the scholars of the Mouseion, the library at the Serapeum may have been more accessible to a wider range of individuals. Perhaps junior scholars, students, educated members of the public, or those whose interests were more focused on religious texts. Egyptian lore, though still primarily in Greek translation or interpretation, or more popular philosophical and literary works. It's often thought to have held duplicates from the main library, as well as its own unique acquisitions. Some scholars suggest it might have contained around 42,800 scrolls, a vast collection by any standard, though significantly smaller than the reported holdings of the main library, which some ancient sources claim held up to 400,000 or even 700,000 scrolls. Figures that are themselves subjects of intense debate. Think of it as the main university research library versus a very well-stocked and impressive public branch library, both vital, but serving slightly different communities and purposes. Oh, you can't get a reader's pass for the Royal Library because you haven't published at least 3 groundbreaking treatises on Homeric grammar this year. Don't worry. The Serapeum probably has a perfectly good copy of the Iliad you can consult, and their cafe does a rather nice fig pasty. The daily life within the Serapeum Library would have shared some similarities with its parent institution. The careful handling of papyrus scrolls, the quiet hum of reading and copying, perhaps scholarly discussions in its porticos. However, its location within a major temple complex might have given it a different atmosphere, perhaps more imbued with religious reverence, or more open to individuals coming for spiritual as well as intellectual enlightenment. It might have been a place where philosophy and theology intersected more directly, a quirky and rather poignant tidbit is that the Serapeum Library seems to have outlasted parts of the main Royal Library. As we'll see, the main library suffered from various misfortunes over the centuries: fires, civil wars, declining royal patronage. The Serapeum, perhaps due to its religious sanctity or its more robust physical location, appears to have remained a significant center of learning for a longer period, possibly becoming the primary repository of Alexandrian scholarship in the later Roman era. The collection within the Serapeum likely reflected its association with the cult of Serapis and the broader religious and philosophical currents of Hellenistic and Roman Alexandria. It would have held important religious texts, philosophical works, especially those with a more mystical or Neoplatonic bent in later periods, and perhaps a significant collection of Egyptian wisdom literature translated into Greek. It was a place where different intellectual and spiritual traditions could meet and mingle, reflecting Alexandria's unique cultural syncretism. Historians still debate the exact relationship and division of labor between the Royal Library and the Serapeum Library. Were their collections systematically coordinated? Did scholars move freely between the two? Was the Serapeum seen as a lesser institution, or simply one with a different focus? The surviving evidence is fragmentary, often relying on later Roman or early Christian writers who had their own agendas. What seems clear is that Alexandria didn't just have one great library, it had a library system, with the Serapeum playing a crucial, if sometimes less celebrated, role in preserving and disseminating knowledge. The eventual fate of the Serapeum Library, as we'll explore when we discuss the destructions, is also a matter of intense historical controversy, often linked to the rise of Christianity and the suppression of pagan cults in the late Roman Empire. But for centuries, it stood as a vital part of Alexandria's intellectual ecosystem, a daughter that carried on the family business of knowledge, ensuring that the whispers from Papyrus could be heard by a wider audience. Beyond the exclusive confines of the royal quarter, it was another testament to the Ptolemaic vision, a recognition that knowledge, to truly flourish, needs not just elite research centers but also accessible repositories that can nurture learning across different segments of society. You've walked the imagined halls of the Great Library and its daughter at the Serapeum, basking in their golden age of royal patronage, brilliant scholarship, and an almost boundless ambition to encompass all human knowledge. It's a dazzling picture, but no golden age lasts forever. As the centuries unfurl, from the height of Ptolemaic power in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE into the increasingly turbulent Roman era and beyond, the vibrant light of Alexandrian learning begins, ever so gradually, to dim. The decline of the Great Library wasn't a single dramatic event, at least not initially one, but rather a slow, creeping erosion, a fading light caused by a confluence of internal weaknesses, shifting political tides, economic woes, and changing intellectual currents. One of the earliest and most significant factors contributing to this decline was a weakening of that crucial royal patronage. The later Ptolemaic rulers, from the mid-2nd century BCE onwards, were often less intellectually inclined, more consumed by dynastic squabbles, civil wars, and the growing shadow of Roman interference in Egyptian affairs than their illustrious predecessors. Remember Ptolemy VIII, Physcon, Potbelly, with his purges of scholars from the Mausian. His reign was a stark example of how destructive a hostile or simply indifferent ruler could be to such a delicate institution. When kings are more interested in assassinating their relatives than in funding acquisitions of rare Hittite poetry, the library inevitably suffers. Stipends for scholars might have been cut, funding for new scrolls might have dried up, and the general atmosphere of intellectual freedom and security could have been compromised. It's hard to focus on composing an epic poem when you're worried the current Ptolemy might decide philosophers are a taxable luxury or, worse, politically inconvenient. Internal strife within Alexandria itself also took its toll. The city, for all its cosmopolitan brilliance, was often rocked by civil unrest, street battles between different ethnic or political factions, and direct Roman military interventions as Rome increasingly asserted its dominance over Egypt. A key historical fact is that Julius Caesar's involvement in an Alexandrian dynastic war in 48-47 BCE led to a fire in the harbor area that, according to some ancient sources, accidentally spread and destroyed a significant number of scrolls, possibly those stored in warehouses near the port awaiting accession into the library, or perhaps even part of the main library collection itself if it was located close enough to the docks. While the extent of this particular fire's damage to the Great Library is hotly debated by historians, was it a catastrophic loss, or a more limited incident exaggerated by later writers? It serves as a clear example of how the library, for all its scholarly seclusion, was vulnerable to the political and military turmoil engulfing the city. You can imagine the librarians frantically trying to save scrolls while battles raged outside. Not exactly conducive to quiet contemplation and cataloging. Quick, Demetrius! Grab the irreplaceable Homeric Variorum, and for Zeus's sake, try not to get singed by Caesar's flaming missiles. My papyrus allergies are bad enough as it is. Economic decline in Egypt under later, less effective Ptolemaic and then Roman rule would also have impacted the library's funding. Maintaining such a vast institution, the buildings, the staff of scholars and scribes, the constant need for fresh papyrus for copying and repairs, the acquisition of new texts required enormous and sustained financial resources. As the Egyptian economy faltered, or as Roman governors diverted resources elsewhere, the library's budget would have inevitably shrunk, leading to a reduction in acquisitions. Fewer resident scholars, and perhaps a gradual deterioration of the existing collection through lack of proper maintenance. Furthermore, the intellectual currents themselves were changing. The vibrant, groundbreaking research of the early Hellenistic period gradually gave way, in some fields, to a greater emphasis on commentary, compilation, and the preservation of past knowledge rather than the generation of new discoveries. While this work of scholarship and preservation was vital, some historians argue that the initial creative spark of the library began to fade somewhat, as Alexandria's intellectual scene became more scholastic and less pioneering in certain areas. This is a complex scholarly debate. Was there a genuine decline in intellectual originality? Or is this perception a result of our own biases and the fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence from later periods? A quirky and rather sad tidbit reflecting a potential decline in scholarly standards or resources comes from examining some later papyrus fragments. Scholars have noted that the quality of handwriting in some texts copied in later Roman Egypt can be significantly poorer than the elegant scripts of the Ptolemaic era, suggesting perhaps less skilled scribes, more hurried work, or a decline in the overall investment in high-quality book production. It's like comparing a beautifully typeset first edition to a poorly photocopied handout. The content might be there, but the care and quality are diminished. The rise of Rome as the new center of the Mediterranean world also shifted the intellectual center of gravity. While Alexandria remained a hugely important city of learning for centuries under Roman rule, it no longer held the same unique, undisputed supremacy it had enjoyed in its Ptolemaic heyday. Ambitious scholars and students might increasingly look to Rome itself, or to other major cities of the empire, for patronage and opportunity. So, the fading light of the Great Library wasn't extinguished by a single gust of wind. It was a slow dimming, caused by a complex interplay of political instability, economic hardship, changing intellectual fashions, and perhaps a degree of institutional inertia. The seeds of its eventual disappearance were sown not in one cataclysmic event, but in these gradual processes of neglect, disruption, and shifting priorities over many generations. The daily life within its halls might have continued. Scholars might still have debated and read, but the vibrant, world-leading dynamism of its early centuries was slowly, almost imperceptibly, slipping away, leaving it increasingly vulnerable to the greater shocks that were still to come. The Great Library of Alexandria, that once unparalleled beacon of ancient learning, has been experiencing a slow, almost imperceptible dimming of its light over centuries of political turmoil, economic decline, and shifting intellectual currents. But what about its ultimate end? How did this legendary repository of countless papyrus scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, finally meet its demise? You're now stepping into one of history's most enduring and frustratingly murky mysteries. The story of the library's destruction is not a single, clear narrative, but a tangled web of conflicting ancient accounts, scholarly debates, and potent, emotionally charged legends. There's no simple answer, no universally agreed-upon culprit smoking a metaphorical or literal literary cigar over a pile of smoldering papyrus. Perhaps the most famous and certainly the most dramatic account of the library's destruction attributes it to Julius Caesar. As we touched upon, during Caesar's military intervention in an Alexandrian dynastic war in 48 to 47 BCE, a fire he supposedly started in the harbor to destroy enemy ships is said to have spread and consumed a vast number of scrolls. Some ancient writers, like Seneca and Plutarch, mention this event, with figures for the number of destroyed scrolls sometimes reaching as high as 400,000. If true, this would have been a catastrophic, though accidental, blow. Imagine the scene: Roman soldiers fighting in the streets, siege engines hurling flaming projectiles, and somewhere amidst the chaos, a desperate cry goes up as flames lick at the warehouses or buildings, housing a significant portion of the world's knowledge. Caesar, your fire's a bit too enthusiastic. You're burning the only decent copy of Sappho's Lost Odes, you Philistine. However, the severity and even the exact location of this Caesarean fire's damage to the library are hotly debated by historians. A key historical fact is that other contemporary or near-contemporary writers, like Cicero, who corresponded with people in Alexandria around that time, or Strabo the geographer who visited Alexandria a couple of decades later and described the Mausian, make no mention of such a catastrophic destruction of the main royal library itself. This has led many modern scholars to suggest that the fire might have destroyed scrolls stored in warehouses near the docks, perhaps awaiting export or recently imported, rather than annihilating the main library collection within the royal quarter. Or perhaps the damage was significant but not total, and the library was able to recover or rebuild its collection to some extent. The Caesar burned the library narrative, while dramatic, might be an oversimplification or an exaggeration that grew over time. Fast forward a few centuries. Another major event often cited in connection with the library's decline or destruction is the religious strife that racked Alexandria in the late Roman Empire, particularly the rise of militant Christianity and its conflict with paganism. In 391 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued decrees effectively outlawing pagan practices. Around this time, a Christian mob, reportedly incited by Patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria, attacked and destroyed the Serapeum, that magnificent temple complex which, as we know, housed the significant daughter library. This destruction of the Serapeum and its library is a well-attested historical event. Whether this act also impacted any remaining parts of the original royal library if it still existed as a major institution is less clear. But the loss of the Serapeum's collection alone would have been a devastating blow to Alexandrian learning. You can picture the scene: religious zealots, fired up with iconoclastic fervor, storming the beautiful temple, smashing pagan statues, and consigning precious scrolls, containing not just pagan religious texts, but likely also philosophy, literature, and science boarded the flames. A truly dark day for knowledge, regardless of one's religious persuasion. Then there's the final and perhaps most infamous, though also most historically dubious story: the destruction of the library by the Arab general Amr ibn al-As, following the Muslim conquest of Egypt in 642 CE. According to a much later 13th century Christian writer named Bar Hebraeus and a few other late sources, Amr, unsure what to do with the vast collection of books, supposedly wrote to the Caliph Umar for instructions. The Caliph is said to have replied that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were pernicious. Therefore, in either case, they should be destroyed. The story then claims that the scrolls were distributed as fuel to Alexandria's many bathhouses and kept them heated for 6 months. It's a vivid, horrifying image, centuries of human wisdom going up in steam. Hot baths today? Folks, generously fueled by the complete works of Herodotus and a rather spicy collection of unpublished Alexandrian erotic poetry? Get 'em while they're hot. However, this account of Arab destruction is almost universally rejected by modern historians as a later fabrication, likely a piece of anti-Muslim propaganda or a pious legend. Contemporary or near-contemporary Arab and Christian sources from the period of the conquest make no mention of such a cataclysmic event. Moreover, by the 7th century CE, the Great Library as a grand, centralized institution had likely long ceased to exist in its original Ptolemaic form, having suffered from centuries of neglect, political turmoil, and earlier partial destructions or dispersions. A quirky, or rather telling detail, is that the 6 months of fuel for the bathhouses trope appears in other legendary stories of library destruction in different contexts, suggesting it might be a common literary motif for emphasizing a great loss of books rather than a factual account. So, what really happened? The most likely answer, and the one that many historians now favor, is that there was no single, at least dramatic, burning of the library that wiped it out in one fell swoop. Instead, its decline and disappearance were a long, slow, agonizing process, a death by 1,000 cuts spanning centuries. It suffered from declining royal patronage, accidental fires during civil wars like Caesar's, deliberate destruction of parts of its collection during religious riots like the Serapeum, dispersal of its holdings, neglect, the natural decay of papyrus in a humid climate, if not meticulously maintained, and simply the gradual fading of Alexandria's unique intellectual dynamism as the Roman Empire itself declined. The scholarly debate over the who burned the library question continues to fascinate and frustrate. Was it Caesar's legions, Christian mobs, or Arab conquerors? Or was it simply the slow, inexorable march of time, politics, and changing cultural priorities? The romantic appeal of a single villainous act is strong, but the reality was probably far more complex, a gradual fading rather than a sudden conflagration. The whispers from Papyrus, by the end, were likely growing fainter and fainter, until one day, there was mostly silence. The fires have long since cooled. The last scrolls have crumbled to dust or been scattered to the winds of time. And the Great Library of Alexandria, as a physical institution, is no more. Its legendary halls, once filled with the rustle of papyrus and the murmur of scholarly debate, now exist only in the fragile records of ancient writers and the enduring landscape of our historical imagination. You stand, metaphorically, amidst these poignant ruins, contemplating the immense loss, the countless unique texts, the irreplaceable works of ancient science, literature, and philosophy that vanished forever, yet, Even in its absence, the Library of Alexandria casts a long and profoundly influential shadow. Its legacy a testament to humanity's enduring quest for knowledge and the powerful dream of a universal repository of wisdom. Its echo is a gift that continues to inspire. The most immediate and tangible legacy, of course, is the surviving body of classical Greek literature and scholarship that was preserved, edited, and transmitted in part through the efforts of the Alexandrian scholars. While we lament what was lost, then we must also acknowledge what was saved. A key historical fact is that many of the texts of ancient Greek authors that form the bedrock of Western classical education, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, the tragic playwrights, the historians, owe their survival and their textual accuracy, at least in part, to the meticulous editorial work undertaken by the scholars of the Great Library. They collated different manuscript traditions, established more reliable texts, wrote critical commentaries, scholia, and created new high-quality copies that were then disseminated throughout the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. When later Byzantine scribes and Renaissance humanists sought out the classics, they were often drawing upon a textual tradition that had been significantly shaped and preserved by Alexandria. It's like having a slightly corrupted hard drive, but the Alexandrian scholars ran a very thorough defrag and virus scan, saving the most crucial files for posterity. Furthermore, the very idea of the Great Library, its ambition to collect and organize all human knowledge, became a powerful and enduring ideal that has inspired library builders and scholars for millennia. The concept of a universal library, a comprehensive archive of human thought, continued to resonate long after Alexandria's scrolls had vanished. Later great libraries, from the imperial collections of Rome and Constantinople to the monastic libraries of the Middle Ages, and eventually to the national and university libraries of the modern world, all owe a conceptual debt to the Alexandrian model. They may not have had Ptolemaic resources or a policy of seizing books from every passing ship, thankfully, but the dream of a central, accessible repository of knowledge lived on. The Library of Congress, the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, these magnificent modern institutions are, in a spiritual sense, descendants of that first great Alexandrian endeavor. The scholarly methods pioneered at Alexandria also had a lasting impact. The meticulous textual criticism, the development of grammar and philology, the systematic cataloging of knowledge as exemplified by Callimachus's Pinakas, the very idea of a research institute where scholars are supported to pursue their studies. These were all foundational contributions to the development of Western scholarship. Even if many of the specific scientific discoveries made at Alexandria were later lost or superseded. The methodology of inquiry, of critical engagement with texts, and of systematic organization of knowledge endured. You could say they wrote the first user manual for how to run a serious academic research center. Rule number 1, acquire all the scrolls. Rule number 2, hire brilliant people. Rule number 3, try not to let the current Ptolemy burn it all down in a fit of pique. Simple, really? A quirky and rather hopeful aspect of the library's legacy is the ongoing, almost romantic quest to rediscover lost knowledge from Alexandria. While the original scrolls are gone, scholars continue to search for fragments, for references in later texts, for any clue that might shed more light on what was contained within those legendary walls. Occasionally, new papyrus fragments are discovered in the sands of Egypt, or a previously overlooked classical author will mention a work known only from an Alexandrian catalog, offering a tantalizing glimpse into that lost world of learning. It's an ongoing historical detective story. The destruction of the library, however it occurred, also serves as a potent cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge and the dangers of censorship, neglect, and cultural vandalism. The loss of so many unique texts is a permanent wound in our intellectual heritage, a reminder of how easily wisdom can be extinguished. This very tragedy has fueled a deep-seated cultural anxiety about burning libraries and has inspired efforts to preserve and digitize knowledge in our own age, to create new, more resilient, Alexandrius in the virtual realm. Historians and cultural commentators continue to debate the true nature and extent of Alexandria's uniqueness. Was it a truly singular moment in intellectual history, or one of several important Hellenistic centers of learning? Perhaps mythologized and romanticized over time due to the dramatic stories of its collection and destruction. While its uniqueness can be debated, its profound symbolic power is undeniable. The Great Library of Alexandria remains a potent emblem of the human aspiration to understand the world, to preserve the insights of the past, and to build a future based on shared knowledge. Its whispers from Papyrus, though faint and often filtered through layers of time and legend, still speak to us of that audacious dream, a gift of intellectual ambition that continues to shape our own pursuit of wisdom today. And so, our journey through the storied halls of the Great Library of Alexandria, from its ambitious birth to its debated demise and enduring influence, now gently concludes. The scent of ancient papyrus, the imagined murmur of scholars in deep discussion, the weight of countless lost scrolls, these impressions may linger, but like the library itself, they now recede into the quiet repository of memory. We have walked with giants of intellect, witnessed the meticulous care of unsung scribes, and felt the thrill of a global hunt for knowledge, all centered in a city that for centuries shone as a beacon of learning in the ancient world. As these images and stories soften, let the spirit of Alexandria's quest for understanding transform into a peaceful curiosity in your own mind. The pursuit of wisdom, in its many forms, is a timeless human endeavor, and the echoes of that ancient library remind us of both the preciousness of knowledge and its vulnerability. May your own thoughts now find a calm and ordered space, like a well-kept scroll, and may your sleep be deep, untroubled, and filled with the quiet satisfaction of a mind that has wandered through the grand corridors of the past. End of script. Sweet dreams.